Hello, 7th, and welcome to Soul Studies. This is our lesson for Thursday, and look where we happen to be today. Right outside the window, we have our beloved U.S. Capitol. So we are still at our nation's capital here, and right in the heart, because we're learning about President Monroe and his administration, so what better to present it right here. So right outside the window, you could see our United States Capitol building. So let's begin. We're going to continue exactly where we left off. Where we left off last time, okay, was the following. We had some notes to complete and post. We had a video to watch and reflect on. You should have that completed. If you do not have that completed, please take a moment and do that now before posting. At the same time, we'd like to continue the notes where we left off on. So what I ask you to do is please make sure you have sound on, make sure you're following along carefully, and we'll all stay right on track. So let us continue. Right now, we will dive into more history of the United States. So what I would like to do is we left off right here, okay? We left off right here where you had the Missouri Compromise, okay? A brief refresher because it's essential. So if you have your notes from yesterday, just a very brief refresher. Missouri Compromise, okay? Missouri was admitted as a slave state, and Maine, which was formerly a part of Massachusetts, would be a free state. Except for Missouri, slavery was to be excluded from the Louisiana Purchase lands. So the Louisiana Purchase that we remember from the Jefferson administration, okay, those states would be excluded from slavery except for Missouri. Basically, this divides the nation in half by saying that slavery is allowed under the 3630 line, okay? So what you're doing here is you have a nation, half of it what is saying slavery is allowed, and the other half saying slavery is not allowed. So you have a nation divided. It's not the first nor last time you will hear about a nation divided. Okay, let's think about perception. Perception is how something is viewed. So how did the North and South review the compromise on the left-hand side? How did the North and South view the compromise on the left-hand side? Well, Northerners felt, you know what, slavery should have just been stopped altogether. Majority, not all, but the majority of Northerners felt that any new state should be a free state. So slavery should be stopped from continuing to expand. So the Northerners are worried that slavery is going to continue to expand. Southerners, though, majority of Southerners had a different feeling. Okay, the Southerners feared that compromising on the issue of slavery would allow the government to eventually make laws about slavery. You have Northerners that felt that slavery should not have been able to continue to expand in any way, shape, or form. At the same time, you have Southerners, because you have to remember, you have to look at it, from a perspective, not saying it's right, but look at it from a perspective of many Southerners where slavery was a major part of their economy. Again, I'm not saying that it's right. I'm just telling you history so you can decipher it and look at it through various perspectives. So slavery is a big part of the Southern economy. Therefore, many Southerners are fearing that if they're starting to implement some compromises here and there about slavery, eventually the North is going to win out and slavery is going to be excluded. So the South is afraid that slavery could eventually end, the last thing that they want. They don't actually say end, but they go into talking about laws about slavery and the fear that there will be more laws about slavery in the future. What is Monroe's foreign policy? What is Monroe's foreign policy? Number one, improved relations with Great Britain. We're gonna go into this in great detail right now. So he's going to want to improve relations with Great Britain. 2, the acquisition of Florida. 3, the Monroe Doctrine. So before I decided where I would present this lesson today, I was almost going to go to the great state of Florida because we're going to discuss the Florida acquisition. But I said, why not just present this from the United States Capitol so we can see the foreign policy of Monroe in great detail. So take a moment, do jot those down, okay, so we can continue to learn about this in great detail, this unit. Okay. Alrighty. So now, why did Monroe want to improve relations with Great Britain? Why did Monroe want to improve relations with Great Britain? Okay. Most people believe that a third British war would come about at one point or the other. What we have here is the Rush-Bagot Agreement, the only revenue cutters on the Great Lakes. It's a tradition of unfortified boundary. So what's happening here is the last thing that the Monroe administration wants to do is risk any type of war with Great Britain, any type of war, especially with territory, with revenue, with boundaries. They're not going to walk on eggshells here, but they're going to be cautious because the last thing they want is to be tested again from Great Britain. We already see those two, right? The Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. The Convention of 1818, okay? It's the 49th parallel between the Louisiana Purchase and Canada, joint occupation of Oregon, and the U.S. could fish Grand Banks. It's the 49th parallel. So what you have here, before we go into gaining Florida, okay, I want you to realize that the United States wants to avoid any type of conflict. Instead, they want to improve their relationship. So Convention of 1818 is going to allow the United States to have a joint occupation of Oregon, and the U.S. could use the Grand Banks to fish. That's being more, don't necessarily want to use the word understanding, but all of a sudden you see Great Britain and the United States compromise slightly. Okay? The Caribbean, though, would remain a challenge for many years. So Caribbean would remain a challenge. So as you can see, all of this comes to land. It has a lot to do with land. It has a lot to coming up with agreements of who could occupy certain territories. And they're going both, not necessarily both sides, but the United States is going to be cautious of any type of escalation. The last thing that Monroe would want to do is to start up another war. So while territory is on our mind, many of you have visited the great state of Florida before. Some of you may have been to Florida pretty recently. Well, Florida, as you know, wasn't an original 13 colony. So when does it come into play? Right here, right now. Why did the U.S. acquire Florida on the left? Why did the U.S. acquire Florida on the left? Okay. What we need to know about Florida during this time is the following. Okay. Spain is going to lose another one of its colonies, which is Florida. They don't lose it to independence, but they lose it to the United States. If you want to take a look at 292, there's a little bit more details on that textbook page. And I'm going to read a few here and there for you to see. Many Americans wanted to gain possession of Florida. Southerners, though, white Southerners, were very worried. They were especially worried about disturbances across the border. This is what the white Southerners worried about. They worried about Creeks and Seminoles in Florida, okay, because they sometimes raided settlements in Georgia. Florida was also a refuge to Africans and African Americans who escaped slavery. So Florida could be a little bit of an issue here. That the United States wants to look into acquiring it, but again, with caution. Spain would not police Florida. It was a haven for maroon communities and Seminole activities. So what I just told you before, Creeks and Seminoles in Florida, okay, they would be in Florida, but sometimes also raid Georgia, which is a state right next to it. So this had been going on for several years. Andrew Jackson, okay, I wrote it as Jackson's Raid. Andrew Jackson, whom you know, okay, is going to come up again here. General Andrew Jackson, how does he connect to Florida? He demands the following. Since the 1700s, Spanish officials protected enslaved Africans who fled from plantations in Georgia and South Carolina. Many times they would flee to Florida. Okay? So basically what happens is Andrew Jackson demands that the Spain demolish certain forts. When the Spanish governor refused, okay, these forts were in Florida. When the Spanish governor refused, the United States invaded Florida and destroyed the fort. That's what we know as Jackson's Raid. He's going to go in and he's going to take it down anyway. He says he's doing it for the best interest of the United States. Why would the United States ask Spain, though, to demolish certain forts? Forts that held African Americans at the time. The reason why is Spain, okay, Florida was a Spanish colony. So the United States asked Spain. But when Spain said no, that they wouldn't demolish those forts, they wouldn't rid those forts, Jackson does it anyway. And what you have here, in 1818, Jackson will again head to Florida with a force of 3,000 soldiers. So imagine Jackson coming in with 3,000 soldiers. Spain protested, but they didn't do much more than protesting, okay? It was busy fighting. They were busy fighting rebels in Latin America, and they could not risk a war with the United States. So we see Andrew Jackson here yet again, using great force, coming in very strongly with not just himself, but other men, to show the strength and almost to kind of push other people around with that strength. A cabinet crisis. Only John Quincy Adams backed what Andrew Jackson was doing, okay? John Quincy Adams at the time, hopefully you remember from yesterday, was the Secretary of State, okay? Spain agreed to peace talks, and this Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, okay, he's going to work out a treaty with Spain's foreign minister. And Spain agrees to give Florida to the United States. Spain agrees to give Florida to the United States in exchange for $5 million. This is known as the Adams-Onis Treaty. Okay? This is the acquisition of Spain. What is the Adams-Onis Treaty on the left-hand side, please? Spain ceded Florida. This is a little review of what I just said. The U.S. assumed claims of its citizens against Spain up to $5 million. The U.S. relinquished claims to Texas, and the southern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase was clarified. So I'm going to review a little bit here. The Adams-Onis Treaty went into effect in 1821. Okay? Again, if you want to take a look, 292 in the text, okay? The Adams-Onis Treaty is essential. It's an 1821 treaty between Spain and the United States. It's when Spain agreed to sell Florida to the United States in exchange for $5 million. The main two people involved here, Andrew Jackson, who raided the area, and John Quincy Adams, whom is serving as the Secretary of State. Since John Quincy Adams is the only one to approve of this, what's going on, okay, a lot of people are left in the dark. A lot of people are left in the dark, unsure where this is going. And you're going to start to see Andrew Jackson looked at in a little different light in the years to come. The southern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase clarified. What that means is the bounds of the United States, their territory in the south, and how far that went. Okay, here are your boundaries. This is exactly what I wanted to show you on the other map. Here you have the United States. Here you have the Adams-Onis Treaty line right here. It clarifies that boundary. This is a line saying the following. The following is U.S. territory. Okay, Convention of 1818. This is exactly everything I just showed you before. These are boundary treaties that happened between 1818 and 1819. Oregon Country. It's going to be a joint occupation by both Britain and the United States. Right here, ceded by the U.S. to Spain in 1819. So, and then you have here Spanish possessions. So the United States map of what we know it today, is not there just yet, but you have this boundary line here, which is set through the Adams-Onis Treaty. Okay, so you start to see this great expansion in territory in the United States. Now, this is another big doctrine that you do need to know. What was the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 on the left-hand side? What was the Monroe Doctrine of 1823? Okay, I'm going to break down a lot. I hope that you can break this down with me. If anybody wants to follow along, 293 in the text, and there's going to be some more information. The Monroe Doctrine is basically, you can take it directly from the text if you like to. It is President Monroe's foreign policy statement warning European nations not to interfere with Latin America. So it's a statement made by President Monroe that warns European nations about interfering with Latin America. Okay, that interference with Latin America, revolutions. So he's going to warn these European nations about why they shouldn't interfere. Okay, you're going to see British interest as well. The British, they worried about other European nations meddling in the Western Hemisphere. So British was worried to see these European nations meddling in the Western Hemisphere, in the West. Basically, they're worried about trade. So they feared that their profitable trade with the newly independent countries would be hurt if Spain regained control of its former colonies. They suggested the United States and Britain issue a joint statement guaranteeing the freedom of the new nations of Latin America. So Britain and the U.S., remember the East tensions during this time period, the East tensions, they want to issue a statement that basically guarantees new nations in Latin America are free. But President Monroe acts independently without Britain. In 1823, in the building behind me, okay, Monroe speaks to Congress, delivers a message to Congress. He makes a bold foreign policy statement, which is the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, this is a big one that you need. This is a huge one that you need. The Western Hemisphere is closed for further European colonization. So, European colonization could no longer occur in the Western Hemisphere. Attempts to colonize would be viewed unfavorably, and no interference would occur with existing colonies. And this here could be the biggest one that you need to know moving forward, especially in the high school. Monroe declared that the United States would not interfere with affairs of European nations. The United States would stay out of any affairs in Europe. That is an essential point to bring about. He wanted to make that clear. Has the U.S. stayed out of European affairs since then? Something to think about. The Monroe Doctrine is sometimes stated even in the present day. Individuals will mention it. What they're really getting at is that last point, that the U.S. said they would stay out of European affairs. At the same time, he did warn, okay? He did warn European nations not to attempt to regain control of the new independent nations of Latin America. In Latin America, you have a period of revolution and liberation. Chile, Venezuela, Mexico, and Brazil have gained their freedom from Spain and Portugal. So I know we have some friends from those areas. Chile, Venezuela, Mexico, Brazil. They gained their freedom from Spain and Portugal during this time. And the United States does recognize as Chile, Venezuela, Mexico, and Brazil as legitimate countries. So the United States recognizes them as their own country. America, though, fears that other foreign countries would not. America fears that other foreign countries like France and or Britain may now want to control these countries in Latin America. So the United States is fearing that. This is why Monroe is telling others through the Monroe Doctrine, he warns European nations not to attempt to regain control of the newly independent nations of Latin America. He warns European nations that they cannot set up colonies or interfere in Latin American problems anymore. So the United States, is not going to interfere in affairs in European nations, but he also tells these European nations, hey, you can't set up colonies or interfere in Latin America anymore. The United States would protect both the North and South America from any European influence. So the United States is going to be that protector. But the United States is not going to involve itself in European affairs, either militarily or politically. So through this doctrine, the United States is going to stay out of European affairs, and the United States is almost acting like this police force, and that's not just a term I use, but a term that's been used in history to protect these North and South American territories from any European influence. This is really, really important to know, okay? Obviously, you might want to ask, what does Britain think of this? Britain supports the statement. The United States did not have the military power to enforce the Monroe Doctrine in all areas, but Britain does support it. The strong navy that the United States, would now have, because they learned a lot from that War of 1812 and not being prepared, that strong navy is going to be able to stop European nations from building new colonies in the Americas. So in both North and South America, the Navy will be essential. This is just a fun primary source of the time period. If I were to have showed this in class with you all, I would ask you, what do you see in this? Obviously, I would first say, is this a primary or secondary source? Of course, it's a primary source because it's a political cartoon from the time period. But basically, you see our great friend Uncle Sam, and he's on the U.S. side, and you kind of see this big wall that's going around, almost circular, seems circular, like it's going around the entire world. You have the U.S. flag here, and this wall border says Monroe Doctrine. Uncle Sam, he is standing with this Monroe Doctrine. What is he doing? He's warning European nations not to attempt to recolonize territories in the Americas. So he's protecting territories to warn European nations not to attempt to recolonize these territories. Okay, that's one image. There's another one, him holding a bat, looks almost like a bat. Teddy Roosevelt is going to use a big stick diplomacy in the future. You're going to hear a lot of that in 8th grade. That comes from the Monroe Doctrine. 294 if you want to see the other political cartoon. Okay, so the United States is now acting like this police force. So here's what we need to know. So the meaning of the Monroe Doctrine. What is the meaning of the Monroe Doctrine? Here's the meaning. Okay? It was not, President Monroe didn't come out and say, this is my Monroe Doctrine. It wasn't called this until 1852. Okay? It's the president of the hemispheric supremacy of control. It's because, like the images that I'm showing you, okay, the U.S. is almost like they are controlling. They are acting as the police force. It's setting a precedent for what's to come. At the same time, it's the president of isolationism with Europe. Some of you may need to work very carefully and play this back if you need to isolate yourself. Let's say if Kwan isolates himself, that means Kwan pulls himself away from the group. He's by himself. To isolate the variable in math, right? If you're isolating X, you're solving for X. So this is the president of isolation with Europe. So isolating involvement in Europe. Because remember, the United States said they would not interfere with affairs in European nations. Okay? Or existing colonies in European nations. What's the meaning of the Monroe presidency? What's the legacy that President Monroe leaves behind? Round of applause, of course, for a great, great president. It's the transition from the Virginia dynasty to turbulent politics of a two-party system. So you're pulling away from that Virginia dynasty and you're going into this two-party system. We start to see, especially when Monroe first comes into power in the 1816 election, you see the limited control that the Federalists now had, because many Federalists now joined the Democratic Republican Party and supported Monroe. It's a big one, guys. You may want to star this or highlight this. The challenge of the slavery issue is going to come up during his administration. What happens with slavery? Is it all free? Is it all slavery? No, there's a compromise, right? There's a compromise. And all of a sudden, you see the nation divided. You see a nation divided on what? On the issue of slavery. North is saying, let's not make any new states, any new territories have slavery. The South is worried about any issues or regulations on slavery because they feel it's going to have a major impact on their way of life and their economy. And territorial expansion, expanding the size of the U.S. We saw the U.S. double in size with a stroke of a pen under the Jefferson administration with the Louisiana Purchase, and you saw it again here with the Monroe presidency. There's a lot here, guys. I ask you to please, please, please work carefully. Let me know if you have any questions. Until next time, submit the notes. Go ahead and make sure you look at the videos too. There's a video post to reflect on. And live from our nation's capital, this is Mr. A, and this is the Monroe presidency. Have a good day.